Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod, where we amplify voices from across the industry, we aggregate those perspectives, and we work to elevate our collective thinking around strategy execution. I'm your host, Joe Mosier. Thanks for joining us today. You know, we're on the cusp of perhaps the largest generational transfers of wealth in history. And there's plenty of examination and speculation of what this means for home ownership, lifestyles and retirement, wealth inequality, etc. Big, interesting questions that we're not going to even take a pedestrian swing at addressing in this show. That's not our lane. But in ag, which is where we focus, we are also experiencing a once-in-a-generation ownership transition, one that's underway actively in row crop agriculture. And I think that we ought to spend some time talking about it, not just what is occurring in terms of farm succession planning and transitions, but what this means for agricultural co-ops. With nearly 400 million acres expected to change hands this decade, and the average farmer now over 48 years old, co-ops face an urgent and strategic question. Will they earn the loyalty of the next generation of growers? Or will that business flow to the national chains, the digital platforms, and the direct-to-farm vendors that might otherwise be kept at bay with the existing membership base? This is our topic today. But before we begin, a quick reminder to like and subscribe to the pod wherever you get your podcasts. It's free. You can do it right now, and it's the best way to support the show and help us amplify the messages and the conversations that we have here every week to help ag executives maintain profitability and growth through better execution. Now, let's get into today's discussion. And I want to talk first about three sort of contextual factors that I think are really, really important. We're going to talk about the actual, what is the data behind the generational transfer that's occurring. I want to talk about farm consolidation and how that intersects with what the next generation of grower might look like and the pace that it's going to happen. And I think we should also spend a little bit of time not just speculating, but frankly revisiting and reviewing what we know about what next generation farmers actually want. Once we do that, then we're going to dig into some of the things that you as a co-op GM, or as you as an independent seed retailer, independent ag retailer, independent grain handler might also consider as you think about maybe you don't have a cooperative member owner structure in place, but your counterparties are going to want and need different things. And this will give you some things to think about how you might engage them and position yourself to win and defend and extend that business. So to start, let's first talk about the generational clock, which is ticking. It's ticking fast, it's ticking loud, and it ticks nonstop. We really want to set the stage, set the scene, and talk about, how fast that ownership base is turning over and why this moment is maybe different from past transitions. I cited earlier a statistic from the 2022 Census of Agriculture from the USDA that the average age of all U.S. farm producers is actually now over 58 years old. That's as of 2022, obviously several years ago. We're coming up on a new census in the years ahead. But this is up from 57.5 in 2017. So it went up by more than half a year in a 5-year period, and it continues along a 4-decade steady climb up and to the right. Only 9% of the nation's 3.5 or less than 3.5 million, but close, 3.5 million producers are under 35. So that's roughly 300,000, a little bit under, young decision makers across all of agriculture. So they are coming up. It's a minority group now, but they're coming up. We've all heard ad nauseum that too many farms lack succession plans. And we're not going to talk about farm succession planning because, one, there's plenty of resources and advisors and support out there for that. 2, that's not something I know very well. And 3, I think we wouldn't add anything of incremental value. But suffice to say, there are estimates out there that nearly 2/3 of all farms that are within a range where you might think about a required transition that's going to occur in the near term, 2/3 of these farms don't have anything formal established. So you have this sort of swelling, entrenched liability flowing year to year as these farms and these farmers get closer and closer to having to make a transition decision and not having succession plans in place to do that. Now, if you're a younger farmer, there's some bright spots. New producers, those that are 10 years or less in the business, actually increased by 11% between 2017 and 2022. So it's over 1 million farmers now. And their average age is just 47 years old, a full 11 years younger than the average overall. But this generational gap is real. There's still some of the silent generation that are hanging on and exiting. Baby boomers are retiring at higher and faster rates than before, certainly faster than their parents did. And, we're going to skip over the Gen X group that I'm a part of, but, millennials and older Gen Zs on the farm are stepping into buying decisions sometimes before this handoff occurs. So this transition is going to happen, yes or yes. It happens very slow and then all of a sudden, I guess you could say, but it's actively occurring. Again, a couple of key stats there. The average age as of 2022 of the U.S. farmer is 58 years old, and there's 400 million acres of U.S. farmland that's expected to change hands this decade. Now, let's talk about farm consolidation, because that's also a prevalent, prevailing trend. The question that I sometimes have when I think about farm consolidation, we know what farm consolidation does in terms of competitive pressure and incentives to co-ops and the agribusinesses that serve them to look at scale and getting bigger and more efficient. But is farm consolidation, is that an accelerant or a barrier to transitions? Right? So if farm consolidation is it speeding up the transition, forcing smaller operations to exit? But does that create barriers for next generation entrants because of land cost and capital requirements? Whatever the truth of the matter is, and we're talking about this for a minute here, with a couple of statistics, whatever the truth of the matter is, the co-ops actually sit at the intersection, which means you'll feel the pain of tensions and dysfunction and dysregulation that occurs. It may also create some opportunities via proximity to influence some of those decisions to the benefit of your long-term viability, profitability, and value delivered to membership. So let's go through a few of these statistics too. The U.S. lost about 7% of its farms between 2017 and 2022, roughly 140,000, give or take. And more than 160,000 farms have closed between 2017 and 2024. Now, we're talking about farms closed, farms lost. This is really, it's more of an entity count than anything else. These are acres that are still under production. Damian Mason and the Business of Agriculture podcast, they talk about this quite a lot at a very detailed level. So check out that show if you're not familiar with that content. But they talk a lot about the acres under production, farm count, are we losing the family farm, et cetera. But the numbers are true that we've lost a significant number of farms over the recent years. Now, at the same time, the average farm size has been rising. So that suggests that as each of these farms are lost, again, those acres accrue to other entities. Nearly 15% of U.S. cropland, roughly 44 million acres, is projected to change hands within the next 3 years through generational transfers, consolidation, and economic pressure. So of that 400 million in this decade, about 10% of that's forecast in the next 3 years. Some of these stats that I was able to research and find online don't seem to jive, because if you just do the math, you say in the next 3 years from 26, 27, 28, 90% of that 400 million transfers, does that mean the back end of that is, the other 90% or some number approximating that, does that transition in the last year of the decade? It depends on how you cut this up. But I think the through line is that there's a significant amount of transition occurring, and it's going to imply and impute consolidation, larger farm sizes, and it's going to start to accelerate. Behind all this, we start to see that there's some uneven distribution of the impacts of consolidation, or where consolidation actually occurs. Across all the different farm sizes, farm types, farm demographics, farm locations, consolidation is it's a steady drumbeat, but it's not an even beat. According to some research that I saw from about a year ago in early 2025 in AgWeb, nearly 2/3 of small farms are quote unquote at risk of sale or acquisition before 2030. But that risk As you go up the chain, a lot of them are clustered around smaller operations. But as you go up the chain and look at larger operations, the risk of sale or acquisition never drops below, about 25%, 26%. So it stays elevated, even among the biggest operations. And the majority of agricultural economists that were surveyed by the Farm Journal Ag Economist Monthly Monitor in January 2025, they all say that the current environment is going to accelerate consolidation. And we know that since January 25, things have not actually gotten much better. Farm incomes in some areas have recovered a bit, but the outlook is still pretty tough. And so the odds of consolidation have probably only increased during this time. What I want to drive home here also is that consolidation's no longer just about efficiency. That used to be the story. You buy incremental, adjacent or near adjacent acreage. You benefit from the scale, both the purchasing procurement scale, equipment utilization, volume, and the marketing benefits that accrue from that. It's not just about efficiency anymore. It's also about financial survival. And the farms that are growing right now tend to be those that are making lean business decisions. And if they're paying cash rent, they have landowners that are shifting more increasingly towards them or their peers who run the farm like a business. Now, what this means for co-ops, think about the implications: fewer, larger members with a higher per account volume that they represent within your business. Each member departure from the business, each member departure or acquisition of their operation matters more and more and more. It magnifies and it accelerates. And so winning the business of farms in transition becomes increasingly important every single year. The transition of a 5,000 acre operation and retaining that business is absolutely existential for a local co-op. So I suspect that much of what I've just said, you've heard some version of that before. So let's treat that as a refresh. Maybe some of it's new, maybe some of it highlighted the challenge, but I just wanted to set that foundation that we know the generational change is occurring. It's not a hypothetical, it's an in progress. It's a felt change in the communities where you operate, and that the actual underlying consolidation is both driven by and impacting that actual transition as well. But the consolidation is impacting the transitions. So what we're really talking about here is what's the impact for the co-ops, right? And what can co-ops do to win that business, to shepherd those membership, to be meaningful to the next generation as this inevitable transition occurs? And to actually answer that question, we should spend a few minutes talking about what do next-gen farmers, for lack of a better term, what does the next generation farmer actually want? Younger co-op members, and I hope that this is not a radical new perspective to you. Young co-op members are not simply a younger version of their parents. They're not current membership 2.0. Their expectations around technology, transparency, efficiency, lifestyle, they're all meaningfully different than what we've become accustomed to in this industry over many, many years, over decades. And the co-ops that don't adapt, you frankly risk losing them. And as we said, the loss of each member now becomes more and more of an existential threat to the co-op as there's fewer and fewer representatives farming the U.S. production agriculture or production acres. So I want to go through and I looked at, and I'm thinking about just a handful of different criteria, just 6 criteria to compare a legacy member with a next generation member. And I want to talk about brand loyalty, technology, kind of purchasing or procurement styles, expectations on information, work life, and also governance and how they interact with governance. So let's think first about brand loyalty. And these are going to be very high level, admittedly, but I just want to kind of give some color here. Brand loyalty, broadly speaking, legacy members really value deep, multi-generational sort of experiences with key brands. They have emotional ties to the co-ops. They have emotional ties to equipment brands. They have emotional ties to the product, the chemical manufacturers that they use. Again, broadly speaking. Contrast that with next generation farmers who are more data driven. They're very ROI focused. Not that legacy members aren't, but the numbers that are maybe used as an ROI input might vary a bit. They're data driven, they're ROI focused, and frankly, they have shown both in their on the farm behavior and off farm behavior and other sort of purchasing channels and consumer behavior, they are far more willing to switch if the numbers are better, right? The perceived cost of switching is much lower for next generation members, which of course, as you would expect, is going to have implications for co-ops that are serving them. Now, when it comes to technology, and this is maybe the third rail of agribusiness and talking about farmers and technology and adoption, I would say that generally speaking, I don't believe the platitudes that farmers are slow tech adopters. I don't think that's true at all. I do think they are cautious adopters. And I do think that they perhaps have a higher resistance level to upfront costs to adopt technology. Maybe they remember a time when you didn't need this stuff to do the work. Perhaps they've gotten burned in the early days of some of the digital ag solutions that were being deployed. Whatever it is, they are more cautious and they resist or have a higher resistance to upfront costs. Conversely, next generation members, more than 50% describe themselves as early adopters of technology. That's how they see themselves. It's part of their identity, is the willingness to try new things and try to be at the cutting edge of what technology can do to improve the business. And that we know they want real-time data at their fingertips. So their fundamental relationship with technology, both its use and what it means for them and their own perception of self, is meaningfully different. Now, there was some literature I read that cited Kansas State's Terry Griffin that said that multi-generational farms tend to adopt more technology than either generational alone, which is interesting. So if you've got a farm operation that is exclusively legacy membership or one that is exclusively a next generation membership, they will both adopt and invest in technology at rates lower than multi-generational farms. And I just wanted to highlight this. It's interesting, and the hypothesis being that in that kind of mixed multi-generational farming operation, the older generation provides the financial resources, and it's paired with the younger farmers' interests and skills and risk appetite to give it a try. So if you actually are able to marry capital availability with younger generation farmers, if that capital constraint were removed through pricing, through business models, through frankly just a more capital-rich operating environment for those younger farmers, their relationship with technology, their use of technology, their expectations on technology are largely going to demonstrate some hockey stick growth.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
Now, when it comes to purchasing and procurement, there's also some interesting differences here. For a legacy member, what we largely see, and again, there's always risk in these kind of broad statements, but we largely see purchasing is very relationship-based. Legacy members value that face-to-face interaction with their local agronomist. If they're hiring precision application services, they know who's spraying their equipment, right? And that relationship, that connection, that shared history is going to be very meaningful to the decisions they make. If you contrast that with next generation farmers, they have demonstrated a willingness, they're much more comfortable to buy their inputs online or buy their inputs by the acre and to shop for the best deals across different channels. Nothing's an absolute, but they have shown that there's a higher willingness there, which again is going to change the relationship with the co-op. If you think about information needs and expectations, legacy growers, they tend to have a seasonal cadence to the information that they want about their farming operation. They trust experience, their own and of those that work with them and the advisors they have. They trust their intuition. And so I would say that the need for information to review the efficiency of their operation, of their acreage, the utilization of equipment, the ROI, it feels more episodic. There are certain points in time in the seasonal cycle, in the fiscal year, where they want to sit down and look at certain numbers. Whereas their younger generational counterparts want instant, precise feedback, right? They really want to know how many bushels are running through the combine. They want real-time accounting. They want to know immediately what the application of bushels at the scale has been against their open contracts. They want to get margin alerts. They want to be actively managing the business via that information that's coming in nonstop real time. And that's a meaningful difference. Just a couple more: work-life balance, looking at the baby boomer generation and the silent generation before them. And to some extent, some of maybe the older Gen Xers, there's a willingness to just kind of knuckle down and muddle through the long hours that are required in this business. And not just a willingness to do it, but it's kind of a badge of honor. Right now, these days, we'd call it sort of celebrating the grind culture, but it really is, working these 18, 19-hour days, working 7 days a week, missing important family events. These are things that are sort of, kind of a badge of honor. It's part of the identity. It's part of the way the business is done. Maybe not celebrated outright all the time, but certainly respected among the older generation. Looking at younger growers, there's certainly a willingness to work very, very hard. But concurrent with that, while they're working hard, they want to actively seek efficiency in their operations. And they want to be able to do things that help them prioritize family time and kids' activities, participating in whether it's sports or taking kids to medical appointments, doing school pickup or drop off, whatever it might be. That factors much more prominently than it has in the past. Perhaps a change in values, perhaps enabled by technology. We're not going to talk about that today, but I do think it's a meaningful difference that the expectation is that I am going to have time with my family, not just time in the combine, time in the shed. And the last one is co-op governance. And I think that's an important one to end with here because that's a very felt difference. With the existing legacy membership, you think about the way they interact with governance of the co-op. They attend the annual meetings. Out of interest, perhaps, certainly out of tradition. And they also very much value the patronage checks, right? Big patronage distributions is a headline. It's a headline to be celebrated for co-ops. And I don't know that we have enough solid data to say this is conclusively true, but there is a felt difference with younger generation farmers around the co-ops and what they expect from governance. They want a voice. They want visibility of how decisions are made. They expect transparency. They expect a lot of modern communications. They expect that faster feedback loop, kind of like the relationship with technology and information. They don't want just a quarterly newsletter. They kind of want to know what's happening all the time. And overall, while I think patronage is still important, it's really de-emphasized. It's certainly less critical to the relationship. And so, again, across brand loyalty, technology, purchasing, information needs, work-life balance, co-op governance, if you go through individual criteria, you will see these very big differences between the membership that we have come to know, come to expect, come to work with, compared to the membership that's coming up through the ranks. The membership that you as a co-op GM or an executive team member have to be thinking about, how are we going to engage these people? How are we going to serve these people? How are we going to meet their needs, knowing that each one of them via consolidation is becoming more and more important to our co-op in the long term. So you really need to think through this kind of side-by-side comparison and get granular around what's going to be different in the future. And we see this, even outside of some of the things I just talked about. One of the very interesting things that just sort of popped up in my research is actually from back in June of 2020, kind of the early days of the pandemic. Sean Skaggs, who was a guest on this show, now leading Parallel Ag, at the time was at Livingston Machinery, working in farm equipment. One of the things that he was cited as observing is that equipment dealers working with younger farmers, they see that their younger farmers are more focused on data than brands, and they're more conscious not just conscious, but willing to think about how switching from one brand to another could give them a financial or an efficiency edge. And that feels so different from a producer that might be in their 70s now, right? The cost difference between a John Deere model hitting the floor this year and a Case IH model hitting the floor the same year, there might be some feature differences, some efficiency differences, some power differences, whatever it might be. But they might, it's you'd like look from afar, but never look with any sort of intent. That is different now. So bringing this all together, what does this mean? What are some of the tactics that you as a co-op can undertake to kind of win over that next generation of farmers, to kind of win their loyalty? And what I've got here is I got a couple sort of like, let's say near term things you could explore now. And then 3 that are long term, I think require multi-year build outs that could actually help move the needle. Certainly not all, but hopefully some of these are relevant and at least spark some of your thinking. So let's kind of go through them one by one here. So tactic number 1 is thinking about something like launching a next generation leadership pipeline. And there's some of the major federated co-ops that have done this with multi-level programming that brings next generation farmers in, gets them involved in membership programs, teaches them about how the co-op runs, teaches them what good governance looks like, teaches them what advocacy and the role of it is, maybe provides some mentorship opportunities, maybe gives them an opportunity to interact with legislators, both at the state and the federal level. So that's one of the things that people have done is try to engage them within the cooperative system, because these programs, if they're tied to the co-ops, actually build an affinity to that experience. And you meet others that are also perhaps future members of the co-op. So what this might mean for you as a local farmer-owned co-op is, consider something like a young producer advisory council, right? Something that perhaps there's a seat, even just advisory in nature at the board level. Something where you can maybe you can invite members under 40 to shadow certain directors at annual meetings. Maybe there's an opportunity to shadow or participate in strategic planning sessions. Again, non-voting members. This would certainly require identifying the right candidates, the right profile, the right interest. But these are things where you can identify influential next generation farmers in the community that have outsized benefit in terms of retention and influencing others, and find a way to perhaps fast track their involvement with experiences tied specifically within your co-op from a governance perspective. The other sort of near-term opportunity is to really ensure that you are digitizing the member experience. Next-gen farmers expect mobile-first, real-time access to their co-op account, right? Their grain bids, their input orders, patronage statements, whether they value patronage or not, based on earlier comments I made here, the contract status. A lot of this is probably already underway, but here's the through line. If your co-op still requires someone to pick up the phone to call for a price, you are losing business to someone else's app on a phone, guaranteed. And you might also want to, as part of this digitization exercise, consider bundling input programs, crop protection and seed and nutrients, and maybe even pricing them by acre. And I share that as an example, illustrative example only, because it's things that simplify decisions for these time-constrained younger operators who have an affinity for technology, they value visibility, and it's on a platform that they're already gravitating towards. They're simplifying their buying decisions. So the 2 near-term opportunities, try to create next-gen leadership pipelines. And second one, digitize the member experience where perhaps you haven't already got that underway. Now, there's 3 longer term ones that we're going to go through here. And the first is rethinking patronage and equity for the younger balance sheets within your membership community. And I have to admit, I'm not a patronage and cooperative equity specialist by any means. And so take this all with a grain of salt. It's meant to provoke some thinking, not to be prescriptive in terms of what you need to be doing. But what we do know is that older members have decades of retained patronage built up, right? They've had a lot of equity, and whereas younger members are coming in very capital constrained, carrying much higher land costs. If you think about average land cost per acre in 2026 compared to 1996. And so, a $3,000 or a $5,000 patronage check deferred for 15 years doesn't really mean a whole lot to a 30-year-old that's holding a $600, $700, $800,000 operating loan on their operation. And so, again, you might want to think about, are there ways that we can, offer some accelerated equity redemption for beginning members? Is there ways we can get loyalty multipliers on Patronage for the first 5 to 10 years of membership? That things that make it more of a felt benefit. It's a traditional point of leverage for co-ops, but it might need to be revisited and modified a bit to attract and retain some younger members. I've read that co-ops are increasingly looking at a variety of new financial structures, things like preferred stock and outside equity, things that can fund growth without burdening younger members with excessive capital retains. That's something that, we clearly could do a whole episode on just that, and perhaps I should get somebody on that knows that inside and out. But that's, again, get creative in thinking about patronage and equity for younger members. The fourth tactic is, and this is where I think co-ops are uniquely positioned for success, is become the transition planning hub. The transitions are going to occur. The consolidation is going to happen. It's happening in your community. Why aren't you sitting at the table when it's occurring? So if roughly 2/3 of farms that are going to need a transition plan don't have a formal succession plan in place, co-ops have a huge opportunity to be the convener, not the advisor, but the convener of that transition planning discussion. And I'm thinking about things like, hosting annual succession planning workshops with the farm credit lenders, bringing in estate attorneys, bringing in farm management companies. It's the idea of it's almost like a platform mindset. Be the place where the transactions occur. You participate in the value creation by creating the space for these things to happen within your four walls, right? Make the co-op the place where families start the hardest conversation that they might ever have in agriculture. Be a part of that. There's a variety of different phased approaches to succession and programming that you can look at from your state cooperative associations and alliances through university extension programs, et cetera. But here's the take home. Every transition conversation for a co-op is a retention conversation. If those acres are going to trade hands, it could impact your retention and you need to be involved. If the co-op is at the table when that farm changes hands, I have to believe that the new operator is far more likely to stay participating with the cooperative. And the fifth and final tactic, and this is perhaps not everyone's going to agree with this, but lead with precision and agronomy and data services. This is going to align with some people's strategies, less so with others. Next generation farmers clearly want agronomic partnerships, not just product sales. And I think that co-ops that invest in precision ag staff, the variable rate recommendations, data analytics, all those things, you become very indispensable. If you look at the multinationals, Bayer and Syngenta and Corteva, they're all building digital platforms that connect directly to farmers, right? There's a reason they're doing that. If co-ops don't offer their own data layer, you're going to risk disintermediation. You're going to risk being cut out of that relationship, those product sales, and ultimately the margin that comes along with that. I guess the simplest way of putting this is that the co-op that owns the farmer's data relationship owns the farmer's business. And that's perhaps an insensitive or heavy-handed way of putting it. We don't seek to own the farmer's business, but you can't let we know that there's more and more data that is collected in real time, that can be modeled and analyzed in very meaningful ways that can drive decisions that further monetize the business. We know these things are true and we know it's going to accelerate. Not participating in that, not being the platform or the interface by which that occurs is, again, a very existential threat to the relevancy of your co-op. And so to close for today, just a few closing comments. The generational transition in U.S. row crop agriculture is not a future event. It's happening now. And co-ops that wait for the annual meeting to discuss this are frankly already really behind. So there's no perfect time for this episode to drop, but I've been hearing it more and more and more during board retreat season and sort of strategic planning season here. And so I thought it was really worth talking about. Consolidation is simultaneously thinning the membership base, and it's raising the stakes on every remaining account within your trade area. And that means that every single time there's a transition, it's more and more valuable. Over the long term, the lifetime value of that member, more and more important that you get in front of that. Next generation farmers are not anti-cooperative, but I do think they're anti-irrelevance. You need to give them the digital tools, the transparent financials, the leadership pathways, the precision agronomic value. Give them the things that show them that they want to engage. If you don't, someone else is going to. And the co-ops that win are going to be the ones that treat this generational transition not as an HR problem, not as a governance checkbox, not as an agenda item at the annual meeting, but as the central strategic priority for the next decade. So I hope that was helpful. I know it's a big, meaty topic, but I want to spend some time, and I'd love to hear from you on how we did, recapping the issue, specifically the tactics. I mean, if there's anybody that would like to come on the show, if you're working with a co-op that has found ways to really do this well and wants to talk about what you learned, we'd love to have you on and feature you. To everybody who listened in, thank you for tuning in today. I appreciate you, of course, being part of the Pacesetter Pod community and the fact that you took the time to listen, that you consider what we have to offer, and that maybe when they're relevant and timely, you action these different ways to improve strategy execution. It's all in support of growing your agribusiness. Thanks for joining us today, and I look forward to having you next time right here on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is the podcastfactory.com.